On the evening of the 12th of February, 1542, a young woman in the Tower of London asked her jailers for the executioner's block. She wanted it carried up to her room. Then she knelt and laid her head on it, over and over, until she was certain she could do it correctly. Most people know Catherine Howard as the foolish teenager who cheated on Henry VIII and lost her head for it. She was executed for something else entirely, and it had happened years before she ever met him. Nobody knows exactly when Catherine Howard was born. The family papers simply don't say. The best modern estimate, drawn from a careful rereading of the Howard wills and the ages of the girls she later served alongside, puts her birth somewhere between 1521 and 1523, most likely in or near Lambeth. Some old accounts push it as late as 1525. The honest answer is that the date is lost. What isn't lost is the family. Her father was Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the second Duke of Norfolk, one of the greatest names in England, attached to one of the emptiest purses in it. Edmund spent his adult life writing begging letters. Her mother was Joyce Culpeper, a widow who had already raised one family before marrying him and then bore him several more children. Joyce died while Catherine was still small. So Catherine grew up with an aristocratic surname, no money, and no mother. In a Tudor family, that combination had a standard solution. Around 1531, she was packed off to live in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess kept two great houses, Chesworth House near Horsham in Sussex, and Norfolk House at Lambeth, directly across the river from Westminster. Both were crowded. Dozens of young gentlewomen, dozens of young men in service, all sleeping under the same roof, and one elderly duchess who had neither the energy nor the appetite to keep track of any of them. Catherine was taught to read, to write, to dance, and to play music. She was not taught anything that implied anyone expected a future for her. She was a poor relation in a rich house, fed, clothed, and fundamentally unwatched. The adults in that house noticed. The first was her music teacher. Henry Manox came into the household around 1536 to give her lessons, and what he took from the arrangement went considerably beyond music. Years later, in a written confession, Catherine described what happened between them. That she had been a young girl and that she had allowed him to touch her intimately. Manox afterwards boasted to other servants that he knew a private mark on her body. No source claims the relationship went as far as intercourse. If the modern dating of her birth is right, Catherine was around 14 or 15. If the older dating is right, she was younger still. Manox was an adult employee, hired to be in a room alone with her. He was the first man in that house to work out that nobody was checking on Catherine Howard. He was not the last. By 1538, Manox had been displaced by someone with better prospects. Francis Derham was a gentleman of the Dowager Duchess's household, older, better connected, and considerably bolder. He worked out how to get past the locks on the maiden's chamber at night, and he came bearing gifts. Strawberries, apples, wine, small luxuries for girls who had none. What followed is one of the best documented private relationships of the 16th century for the worst possible reason. Multiple household servants later testified to it in detail. Catherine's own confession states that Dereham lay with her and, in her words, used me in such sort as a man doth his wife. She put the duration at roughly a quarter of a year. They exchanged tokens. In front of other servants, they called each other husband and wife. She would later insist the relationship had been secured by persuasion and by what she called importune. Forcement, pressure, in other words. How much of that reflects what actually happened at Lambeth? And how much of it was a terrified young woman writing for her life in 1541? We'll likely never know. What her confession does not do is deny that it happened repeatedly. Some in the household believed the pair had formed a binding pre-contract of marriage. It was never tested in a church court. It was never proven. But those two casual words, husband and wife, were still circling her 4 years later. And by then they were worth more than her life. In late 1539, Catherine's uncle got involved. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was the most powerful Catholic nobleman in England, and he had a vacancy to fill. Henry VIII was about to marry Anne of Cleves, and a new queen needed maids of honor. Norfolk secured one of the places for his niece. It is tempting to read this as a plot. The ruthless survivor deliberately planting a girl he knew was compromised. There's no contemporary document that supports it. Norfolk was doing what every Tudor magnate did with a spare niece. Whether anyone in the family knew what had gone on at Lambeth is a question that would nearly destroy them all within 2 years. Catherine arrived at court in January 1540. She was, by every account, small, lively, and extremely pretty. She was also placed within daily sight of a 48-year-old man whose marriage was failing before it began. Henry VIII, in 1540, was not the athletic prince of the portraits. He was enormously overweight, in near constant pain from an ulcerated leg that would not close, and increasingly volatile. His marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on the 9th of July. 19 days later, on the 28th of July, 1540, he married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. She was probably somewhere between 17 and 19. He was 49. The gap was more than 30 years. That same day, across London, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. Henry celebrated his wedding on the day he killed the minister who had arranged the marriage before it. On the 8th of August, she was formally acknowledged as Queen at Hampton Court. She was never crowned. There was no coronation, no procession, no anointing. Henry simply presented her. She chose a motto in French. No autre volonté que la sienne, no other will but his. For about a year, it worked. Catherine reversed the severe dress codes that Jane Seymour had imposed and brought back the jeweled French hoods that framed the face. She acquired gowns and jewels at a startling rate. Henry was openly, almost embarrassingly demonstrative in public. The court, watching an aging king behave like a bridegroom, mostly decided to be charmed. Underneath it, the arithmetic was brutal. A Tudor queen existed to produce a son. Catherine did not become pregnant. A rumor surfaced in the spring of 1541 that she had no household or medical record supports it. Rumors also circulated about whether Henry was still capable of fathering a child at all. Those are unproven too. And then the past arrived at court in person. At some point after the marriage, Francis Dereham obtained a position in the Queen's household as her secretary. Some historians believe he pressured her into it, trading silence about Lambeth for a place at court. The surviving papers don't settle the question. What they do establish is the outcome. The man from the Maiden's Chamber was now on the Queen's payroll, in the Queen's rooms drawing the Queen's wages. There was also Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, a distant kinsman on her mother's side, close to the king and closer in age to Catherine than her husband was by 3 decades. During the royal progress north in the summer of 1541, Catherine began meeting Culpeper at night. The meetings were arranged with the help of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, a woman who had already watched one queen go to the scaffold, and who later said she helped because Catherine would never be quiet until the meetings happened. Some lasted several hours, in back stairways and private chambers, in one house after another as the court moved. Catherine also wrote to him. One letter survives, in her own hand, and it is the only piece of her private voice that exists anywhere. It closes, "Yours as long as life endures." What actually happened in those rooms has never been established. Both of them denied that they had slept together. Under interrogation, Culpeper admitted only that he intended and meant to do ill with the Queen. No witness ever testified to seeing anything more. It made no difference. The thing that destroyed her was already moving, and it had nothing to do with Culpeper at all. In early November 1541, a man named John Lascelles requested a private audience with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. His sister, Mary Hall, had served in the Dowager Duchess's household at Lambeth. She had seen things. Lascelles repeated them. Cranmer did not confront the king directly. He wrote the allegations down, and on All Souls' Day he left the paper in Henry's pew at Hampton Court and let him read it alone. According to the French ambassador, Henry's first reaction was flat refusal to believe a word of it. Then, as the interrogations began producing corroboration from servant after servant, he collapsed, reportedly calling for a sword to kill her himself, and then weeping openly in front of his own council. Cranmer was sent to Catherine. He found a young woman in a state of collapse so extreme that he wrote to Henry that he had never seen a human being in such lamentation. He was reportedly instructed to offer her the king's mercy if she confessed. She confessed. The mercy never came. She was moved to Sion Abbey on the 14th of November. On the 22nd, she was formally stripped of the title of Queen. Then Henry went after the men. On the 1st of December 1541, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were tried at Guildhall and condemned for high treason. 9 days later, both were taken to Tyburn. Culpeper, the higher ranking of the two, was beheaded. Dereham was hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled and quartered. Here is the part that ought to be unbearable. Dereham was not executed for what he did to a teenage girl in an unsupervised bedroom at Lambeth. That was not a crime the Tudor state recognized. He was executed for offending the King of England. The heads went up on London Bridge. Her family scattered. Norfolk wrote to Henry disowning his niece's abominable deeds, and by some accounts offered to take a hand in her destruction personally. It didn't entirely work. The Dowager Duchess and several other Howards were arrested and imprisoned for misprision of treason, for knowing and saying nothing. And in Parliament a bill was being drafted. Not a trial, a bill. On the 10th of February 1542, Catherine was taken from Sion to the Tower by barge. The route passed beneath London Bridge. Deraham's head and Culpeper's head were still there. No source records that she said anything at all. On the 12th, she was told she would die the following morning. That was the evening she asked for the block. At around 9 o'clock on the 13th of February 1542, she was brought out to Tower Green. She was probably 19 or 20. A London merchant named Otwell Johnson stood in the crowd and wrote to his brother afterwards that she made the most godly and Christian end he had witnessed. She acknowledged that her sentence was just under the law, asked for prayers, and prayed for the king. She did not say that she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Culpeper. That line appears first in a Spanish chronicle riddled with demonstrable errors and in no eyewitness account of the morning. Jane Rochford was executed immediately after her. Both women were buried the same day in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few steps away. Catherine Howard had been Queen of England for 18 months and 16 days. But the block was not the strangest thing about that morning. The strangest thing was the piece of paper that put her on it. Catherine Howard was never tried. There was no jury of peers, no Guildhall, no defence, no verdict. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder, a bill that simply declared her guilty and sentenced her to death, without any of it ever being tested in a courtroom. And the Act did something else. Buried in the same statute was a brand new law. It was now high treason for an unchaste woman to marry the King of England without disclosing it first. Parliament wrote that offence into existence in 1542, and then reached backwards with it, and caught a 14-year-old girl in a Lambeth dormitory in 1538. That is what she died for. Not for Culpeper. No evidence of consummated adultery after her marriage exists in any surviving deposition, only the meetings, the intent, and one letter. She died because men had used her before Henry did, and because she hadn't told him. The king who demanded absolute purity from a teenager had kept mistresses for decades and acknowledged an illegitimate son in open court. And he never had to hear any of it. Henry did not sign the death warrant in person. Royal assent was given by commission on the 11th of February, specifically so that the charges would never have to be read aloud in his presence. He was spared the details. She was given the block. She practised with it because it was the only part of her own death that anybody let her control. Was Catherine Howard a young woman making dangerous choices in a court that punished women for making them? or a girl who was never once given a choice that genuinely belonged to her. Thanks for watching History's Hidden Leaves. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.